She sits in the corner, trying to draw air out of a room which seemed to have plenty just a few minutes ago, and now seems to have none. From what sounds like a great distance, she can hear a thin sound, and she knows this is air going down her throat and then sliding back out again in a series of feverish little gasps. But that doesn't change the feeling that she is drowning here in the corner of her living room, looking at the shredded remains of the paperback novel she was reading when her husband came home. We have Richard Stephen King's 22nd novel, Rose Mother, and in what for some may be excellent news, the last of King's books that put domestic violence and spousal abuse up and center. King himself is not very fond of this book, but I have to say it's an interesting experiment for him, and it's 2 stories in one, and we only really get to see one of those stories complete. The other is what Michael Ende would call a story for another day. And unfortunately that other day hasn't come yet. I really want to know some answers, King! Rose Mother is also one of the least known of the King's novels, so I'm giving you here both a spoiler and a trigger warning. Spoiler warning because yeah, I am going to have to talk about some things that you surely wouldn't expect just from the summary I usually give. And trigger warning because boy, if Gerald's Game, Dolores Claiborne and Insomnia gave us some horrible husbands who would do terrible things to their families, they don't hold a candle to the monster that is Norman Daniels. So yeah, trigger warning for rape, domestic abuse and suicidal ideation. Get ready people, because this is a roller coaster ride. I'm AdalisaZ, and without further ado, let's talk about the madness of Rose Mother. Rose Mother is not one of King's own favorite novels. In fact, he considers it a bit pretentious and trying too hard in his own words. However, I think that, being the author, he may be a bit too harsh on himself because he's dealing with a very difficult subject that is not exactly first-hand for him. So it's easy to see the problems with it rather than the good parts. It was published in 1995 and it's one of the very few, if not the only, novel by King that never specifies where it happens. So for the first time, we're not going to see any familiar landmarks, even as this novel is as connected to the Dark Tower as Insomnia before it. On one hand, the story is quite simple and we will get to that in a few moments. But on the other, it has a second story, far more complex, of which we only get a few glimpses, which can be frustrating for some readers, me included. I'd say that it's a great book if you already know that you like Stephen King's style, but only a good first book to get your foot wet if you are not such a big fan of horror, because this is one of those books that it's more thriller than a straight-up horror, so it can be an interesting introduction. There are monsters here, yes, but once again, the biggest one is a human, and most of the story is set up in the real world, with absolutely nothing supernatural happening until, say, page 250 out of 400, more or less. This is also the last book so far where a battered woman is the main character, although just as Gerald's Game was not the first time King had domestic abuse in his books, it was just that he never put it front and center. Rose Mother won't be the last time we see a survivor of domestic violence in his novels, but it is the last time we're going to be delving deep into the situation, making it the central conflict of the book. Which is quite fitting, as this is the one book that puts us in the shoes of a battered woman who is currently escaping her situation, with a very live abuser behind her, after we saw women whose abusers were dead, either recently or long ago, and the one case where we only followed the witness of the abuse. So again, fair warning for both for this video and the book. The descriptions of abuse are graphic and very detailed both for the physical abuse and the mental abuse. The book opens with a long description of a miscarriage caused by abuse. So, if you are not in the mental space to deal with that, skip both the book and this video. Especially the book, trust me on that one. I was ready for it when I reread it for this, and it still hit me hard. Once that is clear, what is Rose Mother about? Let's talk about the basic plot first. Rose Daniels has been living in hell for 14 years. Her husband Norman Daniels is incredibly abusive to the point of having caused her a miscarriage, and has her convinced that she's stupid, ugly, and useless so that no one ever would want her. She doesn't dare to even talk about his abuse because he's a cop, and thus she's sure that other cops would defend him over her and make her situation even worse. However, one day when she's making the bed, she sees a small almost invisible drop of blood on her side of it, next to where her pillow would be. Realizing that she was still bleeding from her nose after his last beating, she also comes to the conclusion that if this keeps going, he will kill her. Or worse, leave her permanently damaged, so despite her fears and misgivings, she just leaves. No packing, no preparation, no real thought of where she will go. The only thing that she takes is his credit card, but she only retires $350 out of it before getting rid of the card in a trash can in a bus station, before purchasing a ticket in the earliest bus possible, not caring for the destination as long as it's far away. Once in the new city, she is led by a good Samaritan to the local women's shelter, Sisters and Daughters, where Rose manages to make new friends who help her start getting over all the trauma that Norman made her go through. And the day when she is ready to get out of the shelter and to a new apartment of her own, she happens upon a painting on a pancho that enchants her, a painting of a woman in a Rose Mother tunic that is standing on a hill, watching a temple far away. In short, things seems to be changing for the better. Unfortunately for her, Norman is not willing to let her go. And as a cop, he has a lot of experience chasing fugitives. And if that wasn't enough trouble, there's also the fact that once her new painting is on the wall of her new apartment, the image on it seems to change. While Dolores Claiborne, Insomnia, and Gerald's Game dealt with domestic abuse, none of them went into so much detail of what entails to be living with your abuser for years on end, knowing that you will never be free, nor with the PTSD that can result from such experience even if you manage to leave your abuser. It also deals with that horrible question: why don't they leave? And why that is probably the worst question you can ask to a survivor of domestic violence, at the same time that it answers that question, at least for Royce's situation and other women who may be in the same one. It also gives us one of the most horrible abusive husbands in the bunch of the books, as it's the one who, even with a Freudian excuse, can't be redeemed at all. I mean, Joe St. George was a product of his time, when men were expected to beat their wives. I am not going to excuse what he tried to do to Selena, that was what made him a monster, but the violence against Dolores was not seen as wrong, not even by Dolores herself, even if we as readers knew he was wrong. Gerald had a terrible fetish and was willing to do anything for that fetish, but other than that, he seemed to be a good enough husband. Most of the time. He was a little bit abusive in the emotional side, but not that monstrous. And that the Penue was literally turned insane by the forces that control our universe, so well, that is the excuse to end all excuses. But Norman Daniels? He's the worst of the lot just by being himself. And of course, he proves that all cops are bastards. ACAB. But before going on about Norman, and yes, his Freudian excuse that is revealed way late in the novel and does nothing to explain his actions, let's talk about Rosie, his battered wife and the main character of the novel. As I said before, we meet Rosie when she's having her miscarriage, losing a baby that she was expecting with excitement, even if Norman seemed less enthusiastic about being a father. The whole prologue is a long drawn scene where Rosie is trying to control her breath, not to vomit due to the beating Norman gave her, just as he's calling 911 saying that she fell from the stairs and may be losing her baby. She is praying that she is not, in fact, having a miscarriage, but the truth is that yes, Norman beat her badly enough that she is now bleeding and there will be no baby born. The important part, however, is how cold, calculating, and smart Norman is about his excuse. She knows that they will believe him, and that he knows how to fix the scene so that it fits what he's telling, so that no one suspects otherwise. After all, Norman is a cop, and he has seen this kind of thing so many times it's like second nature to him. She also knows that his friends in the precinct will defend him even if she tells the truth. She also knows that his friends at the precinct will defend him even if she tells the truth. There is a blue thin line thing going on there, and she has seen enough of her husband's co-workers to know that they are the same as him when it comes to disciplining women. Not only that, but because she married right off of high school and immediately became a housewife, she has no skills to earn her own money. Not that Norman would let her get a job. And if she left, she'd be destitute. In short, Rosie knows that she's in hell, but she's afraid that trying to get out would be worse, as if Norman caught her, he'd surely kill her. That is, until the day she realizes that dying at Norman's hand was the better outcome from his beatings, and the worst possible scenario would be that he didn't kill her but leave her permanently damaged and alive. So that's when she leaves, without a plan, without a real direction, except remembering the things Norman told her about how he caught fugitives to try and do the opposites of that. She knows that she will probably end up homeless, as she is in her own mind as useless, ugly, and unlovable as Norman told her for her whole of the marriage. But at that moment she's convinced that at the very least she will be able to sleep without her kidneys crying from the pain of the last beating. This is the saddest thing, by the way. How Rosie refers to herself as she talks to others, parroting the words that Norman beat into her brain. It takes about 4 months for her to start believing in herself again, to realize that she's not the useless woman Norman insisted she was. After all, she kept the house spotless for 14 years, which meant that at the very least she was able to get a job as a maid in a hotel before she was discovered as a talent for audiobook recording, which I love it because it was so out of the field back in 1995. Unfortunately, that is also when Norman finally gets a break on his investigation of where she went and starts pursuing her to make sure that she never steals again something from him. Norman Daniels is a monster. He's so bad that he should be remembered right next to Margaret, "My child is the demon and I will torture her forever" White, and Annie, "I'm your number one fan" Wilkes. Outside of Randall Flagg, I can't think right now of a male character who is worse than Norman, because while we have seen terrible men and terrible violent men in King's Wars before, there is no one that reaches the depths of Norman's violence because, unlike those others, Norman knows he's going insane and is welcoming it. Once again, if you have not followed the news or know a survivor of domestic violence, at first Norman can even be seen as an exaggeration, a caricature of a domestic abuser and a corrupt cop who is written so over the top to make Rosie's plight to look worse. Unfortunately, that is not the truth. Norman is quite in line with normal, common garden variety abusers in real life, and the way in which the cops in his town defend him and deny his accusations is also a sad reality. The worst part is not just knowing all what Norman did to Rosie, or to those he perceived as helping Rosie. Not only he kicks and punches, Rosie herself will tell us in the novel that kidneys were her preferred target, as it was where he could let himself go and not worry that anyone would see the bruises, but he also likes to bite. Bite hard enough that after an episode he needs to take ibuprofen to numb the pain in his jaw, and just hard enough to bite parts of the victim's anatomy. And in one particular occasion he also used a tennis racket to make sure that Rosie knew exactly who was the owner or where that tennis racket went. It was definitely not nice. To top it off, Norman hates everyone not white, male, and a cop. Big warning here if you get the book. Wherever we are on Norman's POV, he uses slurs. A lot of them, and written clearly and without censorship. We can have later the discussion of how valid this is for writers and books, both recent and from the past, but I just want to warn you in case you want to read the book. It is clear that only the bad people use those words, that Norman is wrong for thinking like that and using those words to refer to people, but they are still there, and I know that some readers might be put off by them. The main horror of the book, is seeing how Norman stalks Rosie little by little. At first, she and us, the readers, think that she may have gotten scot-free, as she left no clue of where she was going, since she didn't know where she was going. Except for one thing. One little thing that any modern reader would pick up as we understand the outside world very well, but she didn't realize at the time that she was so sheltered. I will not tell you what that clue is, because when you read it, I want it to hit you the same way it hit me, with a lot of despair as you know how easily it would have been for her to really escape. And let's be honest, for 3 people to survive, since Norman wouldn't have gotten his hands on them if not for that tiny thing. Finally, speaking about Norman, there is that fruit and excuse I mentioned. Norman is a result of a cycle of violence. His own father was abusive, both physically, emotionally, and sexually, which of course made Norman grow to believe that strength means might, and that the best way to deal with anything is by punching it hard enough so it stops being a problem. Which is, of course, one of the main themes of the book, the fact that violence only brings out more violence. At this point, you may be wondering, okay, but what about the supernatural part? And you said that it was 2 stories in one. What about the other story? And those are very good questions to be asked. It's just that the supernatural plot is a little bit less horror and a little bit more fantasy, so I wanted to get to the horror parts out first. See, just like in The Talisman and The Dark Tower 2, we will talk about that at some point, I promise, Rose's mother deals with the traveling between worlds. In this case, Rosie finds that the picture she got in a pawn shop was a portal to the place that was pictured in it. She doesn't know where it is, but King readers know that it's somewhere in the central world where Gilead, the birthplace of the gunslinger, once stood thanks to context clues. There, she meets a woman, Rose, who happens to be her twin. Well, mostly because she's far, far more powerful and old, probably not human, and worse, she's sick. We never find out what the illness is or when Rose got it. Rose, the other woman, the painting woman. Oh god, okay, so Rose is the non-human, Rosie is the human one. That is going to be a little bit clearer. But we know that it's eating her from the inside like a cancer, and it's even worse because it's driving her mad. Rose's companion, a woman named Dumas, who happens to be the twin of a woman that once was killed by Norman, explains to Rosie that they need her help to get a baby out of the temple that is also seen in the picture, and it's guarded by a blind one-eyed bull that will not let either Rose nor Dumas get close. But that if Rosie helps them, then Rose will repay her kindness by divorcing her from Norman permanently. The whole trip to the temple is an epic quest on itself. Rosie needs to face the ghost of her past, the dangers of temptation, and the aforementioned blind bull, following rules that seems absurd but at the same time can mean the difference between life or death, like, say, getting the seeds from a tree in a garden inside the temple, but afterwards not touch her mouth with the same hand or else. Not only that, she has to do all that naked. It's an interesting way to also show her growth, from the scared victim that she was at the beginning of the book to the strong survivor that she becomes at the end. Problem is, we never find the reason for all of that. Rosie fulfills her part of the deal, saves the baby and gives her to Rose, who in turn, we're told, has to carry the baby somewhere and hand her to someone else, her real parents, we hope. And Rose also fulfills her own part of the deal, and boy, the way in which she deals with Norman is amazing, and you have to read it on your own. But we never find out why the baby was important, why she was in the middle of the maze, why Rose couldn't save her herself, where Rose was going, or, anything. Rose's story is bigger than Rosie's, and at the same time, absolutely meaningless for Rosie's story, so we are never told more than what we need to know. It's a bit frustrating, yes, and we're still waiting to see if King will ever tell us Rose's story, but for the book itself, it also works. Because again, the important thing is not the whys or the whos, but Rosie's trip to the temple, because that signalizes her growth as a person. Finally, and to end the book in an interesting note about the cycles of violence, King also tells us that Rosie didn't live quite effortlessly happily ever after. She did eventually earn her happy ending, yes, but it took more than just getting rid of Norman. Violence is a cycle, and more often than not, those who were victims of it run the risk of becoming violent themselves. So the epilogue tells us that from time to time, Rosie got angry, really angry at everyone, and wanted to lash out, just like Norman had lashed out at her. The difference? She decides to get help and stop herself before it gets too bad. That is the only thing that can actually break the cycle. To realize that sometimes you too can be the baddie, and that only you can stop yourself preferably with the help of some therapy and meditation. Despite being one of King's lesser known books and one of King's own least favorites, I can't recommend Rose Mother enough if you like strong female protagonists and don't mind a little bit of mystery and vagueness. Just be mindful of the warnings I gave at the beginning regarding the content, as I know that not everyone is in the right mind space to read about domestic violence in detail, even if it is fictional and the abuser meets a gruesome end. In my opinion, it's also the kind of story that would lend itself perfectly to a miniseries adaptation, and maybe if Hollywood stops remaking the old King's classics enough to realize they still have a ton that they have never adapted, it will happen one day, and hopefully it will be a good adaptation and not whatever the hell Firestarter was. I want to thank my dear patrons Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessica, and Ellie Riley, as well as my first supporter Tanya Pineda and Amy Song, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos would not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, written link on description, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or, if you prefer a one-off offer, at Coffee with just one donation of $3, you will get a mention in the next 3 videos I make. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course, just sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. And now, it's time to leave Rosie to her happy ending and walk along a very different path. There's a hallway in an old prison, lined with green tiles that can lead to life or death, depending on the direction you take at the end, left or right. So join me next time when we walk together the Green Mile.